A disabled veteran approached the royal guard. What he did next moved everyone to tears. The UAC. Morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as Thomas Mitchell wheeled his chair through the busy streets of London. His weathered hands gripped the wheels tightly, navigating through the crowd of tourists who had gathered to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace. Thomas was not like the other visitors that day. Beneath his simple navy jacket, scars told stories of battles fought in distant lands. His left leg had been lost to an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan 3 years earlier, but his eyes still held the same determination that had carried him through countless military operations. At 42, he had learned to live with his new reality, though some days were harder than others. The crowd pressed closer to the palace gates, everyone eager to get the best view of the spectacle. Thomas found himself pushed further back, his wheelchair making it difficult to see over the standing spectators. Children sat on their father's shoulders, cameras clicked constantly, and tour guides spoke in multiple languages about the tradition they were about to witness. As the ceremony began, the famous red-uniformed guards marched in perfect formation. Their black bearskin hats stood tall and proud, their faces expressionless as they performed the ritual that had continued for centuries. The precision of their movements reminded Thomas of his own military days, when he too had stood at attention, proud to serve his country. But something was different today. As Thomas watched from his position at the back of the crowd, one of the guards seemed to notice him. The guard's eyes, though trained to look straight ahead, appeared to flicker in Thomas's direction for just a moment. It was so brief that Thomas wondered if he had imagined it. The ceremony continued with its usual pageantry. Drums beat in rhythm, commands were shouted with authority, and the guards moved like a well-oiled machine. Thomas felt a familiar pang in his chest, a mixture of pride and loss. He remembered when he could stand that straight, when his body was whole and strong. A young boy near Thomas complained loudly to his mother that he couldn't see. Without hesitation, Thomas called out softly, "Hey, little man, want to sit on my lap? You'll get a better view up here." The boy's mother looked uncertain at first, but Thomas's gentle smile and the small military pin on his jacket seemed to reassure her. As the boy climbed onto Thomas's lap, chattering excitedly about the pretty soldiers, Thomas felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in months. The child's innocent joy reminded him why he had served, to protect moments like these, to ensure that children could grow up safe and free. The guard who had noticed Thomas earlier was now closer, having moved with his unit during the ceremony. This time there was no mistaking it. The guard was definitely looking at Thomas. Behind the stoic expression required by protocol, Thomas could see something in the young man's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. Thomas straightened his shoulders instinctively, his military training kicking in despite being in civilian clothes. Even in his wheelchair, he sat with the bearing of a soldier. The guard's subtle acknowledgement meant more to Thomas than all the sympathy he had received from well-meaning strangers over the past 3 years. The ceremony was reaching its climax, but Thomas found himself more interested in this silent communication with the guard than in the formal proceedings. There was something special happening here, something that went beyond the tourist attraction and touched on deeper bonds of service and sacrifice. As the boy on his lap pointed excitedly at the guards, Thomas realized that this day was going to be different from any other since his injury. He couldn't have known that in just a few minutes. His life would take an unexpected turn that would restore his faith in humanity and remind him that his service would never be forgotten. The crowd began to shift as the ceremony neared its end, but Thomas remained still, his eyes locked on the guard who had noticed him. Something told him to wait to see what would happen next. His instincts, honed by years of military service, told him that this encounter was far from over. As the formal ceremony concluded, the crowd began to disperse slowly. Tourists took final photos, families gathered their belongings, and the excitement of the moment started to fade into memory. Thomas helped the little boy down from his lap, receiving a shy thank you and a small wave as the child rejoined his parents. The guards were completing their final movements, preparing to return to their posts. Thomas watched as most of them marched away in formation, their boots clicking rhythmically against the stone ground. But the guard who had been watching him remained behind, standing at his post near the palace gates. Thomas wasn't sure what to do. The protocol for interacting with the Queen's Guard was well known. Tourists often tried to make them laugh or react, but the guards were trained to remain completely still and expressionless while on duty. Thomas respected this tradition and had no intention of being another tourist trying to get a reaction. But as he began to wheel his chair away from the gates, preparing to leave like everyone else, he heard a voice call out softly behind him, "Sir." The word was spoken quietly, almost under the breath, but it carried the unmistakable tone of military address. Thomas turned his wheelchair around to see the guard looking directly at him. The young man couldn't have been more than 25, with sharp features and the kind of bearing that came from rigorous training. His red uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, his white gloves spotless despite the ceremony he had just performed. "I noticed your service pin, sir," the guard said, his voice barely audible to anyone beyond Thomas. He wasn't supposed to engage with the public while on duty, but something about Thomas had compelled him to break protocol, if only slightly. Thomas looked down at the small military insignia on his jacket, a simple pin that marked him as a veteran of foreign service. He had worn it today without really thinking about it the way he did most days, but now he understood why the guard had been watching him. "Afghanistan 2021, Thomas replied quietly, matching the guard's discreet tone. He didn't elaborate, didn't mention the explosion or the months of recovery that followed. Those details weren't necessary. The pin in his wheelchair told enough of the story. The guard nodded slightly, a movement so subtle that only someone watching closely would have noticed it. "My brother served there too," he whispered. "He didn't make it back." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow.
In that moment, he understood everything. The recognition in the guard's eyes, the subtle acknowledgement during the ceremony, and now this quiet conversation that was bending the rules of protocol.
This wasn't just one soldier recognizing another. This was personal. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, and he meant it. He had lost friends overseas, good men and women who deserved to come home to their families. The weight of survivor's guilt was something he carried every day, along with his physical scars. The guard stood perfectly still, maintaining his professional composure even as they spoke. "He would have liked you," he said quietly. "He always said the real heroes were the ones who came back broken but kept going anyway." Thomas felt his eyes begin to well up. He hadn't expected this conversation, hadn't prepared for this moment of connection with a stranger who somehow understood his struggle in a way that most people couldn't. The guard's brother had made the ultimate sacrifice, while Thomas lived with the daily reminder of his own. "What was his name?" Thomas asked, wanting to honor the memory of a fellow soldier. David Morrison. He was 22 when it happened," the guard replied, his voice steady but carrying the weight of loss that never fully goes away. "He joined the army right after secondary school. Said he wanted to make a difference in the world." Thomas nodded, thinking of all the young soldiers he had served alongside, their faces filled with hope and determination. "I'm sure he did make a difference. They all do, just by being willing to serve." The guard's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. Here was a man who understood not just the sacrifice of service, but the ongoing battle that families faced long after their loved ones were gone. Thomas had become a living bridge between David's memory and his brother's grief. Around them, the normal activity of the palace continued. Other guards maintained their posts. Tourists took pictures at a respectful distance, and life went on as it always did. But in this small bubble of conversation between two men connected by service and loss, something profound was happening. The guard glanced around quickly to make sure no supervisors were watching, then leaned slightly closer. "Would you mind if I asked you something, sir?" Thomas nodded, curious about where this conversation was leading. The young man's request was about to change everything. Guard Morrison took a deep breath before speaking again. The weight of what he was about to ask was evident in his carefully measured words. "Sir, would you consider doing something that might seem unusual? I know it's a lot to ask, but it would mean everything to me and my family." Thomas studied the young man's face, seeing the vulnerability behind the professional mask. "What did you have in mind?" "My parents have never gotten over David's death," Morrison explained quietly, his eyes scanning the area to ensure their conversation remained private. "They've been struggling for 2 years now. My mother barely leaves the house, and my father, well, he's angry at everyone and everything, They refuse to go to the memorial services or talk to other military families. They've shut themselves off from the world. Thomas understood this pain. He had seen it in the families of his fallen comrades. The way grief could isolate people and make them feel like no one could possibly understand their loss. That's not uncommon, he said gently. Everyone processes grief differently. I've tried talking to them, but I'm just their surviving son. They look at me and see who David could have been if he'd lived. Morrison continued, his voice barely a whisper. But you were there. You understand what David went through, what all our soldiers go through. You've paid a price too, and you're still here, still fighting your own battles. The request was becoming clearer to Thomas, and it touched something deep in his heart. You want me to talk to them? I know it's asking a lot from a complete stranger, Morrison said quickly. But I've watched you today, the way you helped that little boy, the dignity you carry yourself with despite everything you've been through. My parents need to see that. They need to understand that David's sacrifice mattered, that there are people like you who carry on because of what soldiers like David did. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of what was being asked of him. He thought about his own dark days after his injury, when he had questioned whether his life still had meaning. He remembered the people who had helped pull him out of that darkness, other veterans, counselors, and even strangers who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. I'm not a counselor or a chaplain, Thomas said finally. I'm just another broken soldier trying to figure out how to live with what happened to me. But that's exactly why they need to meet you, Morrison insisted. You're proof that life can continue after loss, that meaning can be found even in the hardest circumstances. My parents have forgotten that David would want them to keep living, to find joy again. A group of tourists approached, and Morrison immediately returned to his formal posture, staring straight ahead as if the conversation had never happened. Thomas played along, pretending to admire the architecture while the visitors took photos nearby. When they moved on, Morrison relaxed slightly again. My shift ends at 6 tonight, Morrison said quietly. If you're willing, I could take you to meet them. They live just outside London, about an hour by train. I know it's asking a lot of your time. Thomas thought about his empty apartment waiting for him, the routine of physical therapy and doctor's appointments that filled most of his days. Since his injury, his social circle had shrunk dramatically. Many of his old friends didn't know how to act around him anymore, and dating had become complicated by his disability. The truth was he was lonely, and the chance to help another family gave his life a purpose he hadn't felt in months. What are their names? Thomas asked, his decision already made. Relief flooded Morrison's face. James and Margaret Morrison. They live in a small town called Ashford. James used to be a carpenter before David died, but he stopped working. Margaret was a teacher, but she took early retirement after. I understand, Thomas said, cutting him off gently. He could imagine the scene. Parents so consumed by grief that they had stopped living their own lives. He had seen it before, and it always broke his heart. You'll really do it? Morrison asked, hardly believing that this stranger was willing to give up his evening to help his family. Yes, but I have one condition, Thomas said firmly. You don't tell them I'm coming. If they know in advance, they might prepare speeches or put up walls. I want to meet them as naturally as possible, as just another person who knew David through service. Morrison nodded eagerly. I usually have dinner with them on Thursdays anyway. I could bring you as a friend from work? That works, Thomas agreed. But remember, I can't promise I'll say the right things or that it will help. Grief is complicated, and everyone has to find their own way through it. The fact that you're willing to try means everything, Morrison said, his gratitude evident despite his professional composure. I haven't seen my parents smile in 2 years. Maybe you can remind them that it's okay to be happy again, even while missing David. As they finalized their plans, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since his injury, the sense that he was about to make a real difference in someone else's life. The meeting with the Morrisons would challenge him in ways he hadn't expected, but it would also give him something precious, the knowledge that his continued existence had purpose beyond his own survival. The train journey to Ashford gave Thomas time to think about what he was walking into. He stared out the window at the English countryside rolling by, his mind drifting between memories of his own recovery and thoughts about the grieving parents he was about to meet. Morrison sat beside him, no longer in his ceremonial uniform but wearing civilian clothes that made him look even younger than his 25 years. "Tell me more about David," Thomas said, as the train swayed gently on the tracks. "What was he like before he enlisted?" Morrison's face lit up for the first time that day. "He was the funny one in our family. Always making jokes, always trying to make people laugh. He played football at school. Not professionally, but he was good enough that some scouts looked at him. But after 9/11 happened when we were kids, he became obsessed with serving his country." Thomas nodded, understanding the pull that many young people felt after that defining moment in history. "Did your parents support his decision to enlist?" "Not at first," Morrison admitted. "They wanted him to go to university, maybe become an engineer like our grandfather. But David was determined. He said he couldn't live with himself if he didn't do something meaningful with his life. Eventually, they came around and were incredibly proud of him. The train pulled into smaller stations along the way, and Thomas watched families reuniting on platforms, people heading home after long days of work. Normal life continuing as it always did, even while some families like the Morrisons remained frozen in grief. "What do they do with their time now?" Thomas asked, trying to understand the depth of their isolation. Morrison's expression darkened. "Mom spends most of her day in David's old room, organizing his things over and over. She's turned it into a shrine, basically. Dad sits in his workshop but doesn't actually make anything anymore. He just holds tools and stares at the wall. They barely speak to each other, even though they're in the same house all day." Thomas had seen this before. Couples who loved each other but couldn't find their way through shared grief. Sometimes loss brought people together, but just as often it drove them apart. Each person drowning in their own private version of pain. "Do they blame themselves?" Thomas asked gently. "I think so, though they've never said it directly. Mom keeps saying she should have tried harder to talk David out of enlisting. Dad thinks he should have forbidden it somehow. They both seem to believe that if they had been different parents, David would still be alive." The guilt of surviving parents was something Thomas understood all too well. His own mother had struggled with similar feelings after his injury, wondering if she had somehow failed him by raising a son who chose military service. It had taken months of gentle conversations to help her understand that his choice had been about honor and duty, not about anything lacking in his upbringing. As they neared Ashford, Morrison grew more nervous. "What if this backfires?" he asked suddenly. "What if seeing you makes them worse instead of better? You're living proof that soldiers come home injured, and that might make them think about what David would have suffered if he'd survived instead of died." Thomas had considered this possibility during the train ride. "That's a risk we'll have to take. But in my experience, most parents would rather have their children alive and struggling than gone forever. Your parents might initially be upset to meet me, but deep down, they probably wish they could trade places with you, having a son who came home different instead of not at all." The train pulled into Ashford Station, a small quaint stop that served the surrounding rural communities. As they disembarked, Thomas noticed how Morrison's shoulders tensed with each step toward his childhood home. The young man was carrying his own burden of survival guilt, feeling responsible for his parents' well-being while dealing with his own grief over losing his brother. The walk from the station took them through narrow streets lined with old cottages and small gardens. It was the kind of community where everyone knew their neighbors, where David Morrison had probably grown up riding bicycles with friends and playing in local parks. Thomas could imagine a young boy here, dreaming of adventure and service, never knowing that his choices would lead to heartbreak for those who loved him most. "That's our house," Morrison said quietly, pointing to a small stone cottage with a red door and overgrown garden. The curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, and the whole place had an air of sadness about it, as if the building itself was mourning. As they approached the front door, Thomas could hear voices inside, a woman's voice calling out something about dinner and a man's gruff response. Normal domestic sounds that belied the pain he knew existed within those walls. Morrison paused with his hand on the door handle. "Are you sure about this?" he asked one final time. Thomas straightened his shoulders and checked that his military pin was visible on his jacket. "I'm sure. But remember, this is going to be hard for all of us. Don't expect miracles, just honest conversation." Morrison knocked on the door instead of using his key, calling out, "Mom, Dad, it's me. I've brought a friend for dinner. Hope that's all right." The response came immediately. Margaret Morrison's voice, flustered but trying to be welcoming. "Oh, goodness, I wish you'd called ahead. I haven't prepared enough food and the house is a mess." But it was too late for second thoughts. The door was opening and Thomas was about to meet the parents whose grief had inspired their surviving son to reach out to a stranger for help. The door swung open to reveal Margaret Morrison, a woman in her late 50s with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and tired eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to truly see the world around her. She was wiping her hands on a kitchen towel, clearly flustered by the unexpected guest. "Mum, this is Thomas Mitchell," Morrison said gently, stepping aside to allow his mother to see Thomas in his wheelchair. "We met at work today and I invited him for dinner. I hope that's all right." Margaret's eyes immediately went to the wheelchair, then to Thomas's face, then to the small military pin on his jacket. Thomas watched as understanding dawned in her expression, the same recognition her son had shown hours earlier at the palace. Of course, please come in," she said, stepping back to allow them entry. But Thomas could see the way her hands trembled slightly, the way she glanced toward the closed door at the end of the hallway. David's room, no doubt. The inside of the house was neat but felt frozen in time. Family photos lined the walls, many featuring a young man who looked remarkably like Morrison but with a broader smile and more mischievous eyes. This had to be David, captured in moments of joy that now seemed impossibly distant. James Morrison emerged from what must have been his workshop, a tall, broad-shouldered man with calloused hands and sawdust still clinging to his shirt. His greeting was polite but guarded, the kind of careful hospitality that people offer when they're not sure they want company, but don't want to be rude. "Dad, this is Thomas," Morrison repeated the introduction, and Thomas extended his hand for a firm handshake. James's grip was strong but brief, and Thomas noticed the way the older man's eyes avoided looking directly at the wheelchair. The dinner conversation started awkwardly, with Margaret fussing over whether there was enough food, and James making stilted comments about the weather. Morrison tried to fill the silences, but the weight of unspoken grief hung over the table like a thick fog. Thomas decided to address the elephant in the room directly. "Your son tells me you lost David in Afghanistan," he said quietly, setting down his fork. "I served there too. I'm very sorry for your loss." The effect was immediate and profound. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears she had been holding back. James's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he stared down at his plate. "Were you there when it happened?" Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, I wasn't," Thomas replied honestly. "But I know the place where he died. I know what he was fighting for, and I know the kind of courage it took for him to be there." James looked up sharply. "Courage?" He was 22 years old. He didn't know anything about the world, didn't understand what he was walking into. "We should have stopped him." The anger in James's voice was raw and painful, but Thomas had expected it. "You couldn't have stopped him," he said firmly. "I've met thousands of soldiers like David. When they make up their minds to serve, nothing can change that. It's not about being young or naive. It's about having the kind of character that puts others before yourself. But look where it got him," Margaret said, tears now flowing freely. "Look where it got you too. How can any of this be worth it?" Thomas took a deep breath before answering. This was the moment that mattered most. The reason he had come here. "Mrs. Morrison, I won't lie to you. There are days when I ask myself the same question. When I'm struggling to do simple things that used to be easy, when I'm dealing with pain or feeling sorry for myself, I wonder if any of it mattered." The room was completely silent now, even Morrison holding his breath as Thomas continued. "But then I think about the little boy I helped today at the palace, the one who got to watch the ceremony in safety and wonder. I think about the schools that are open in Afghanistan now, because of what soldiers like David accomplished. I think about the families who are alive today because brave young men and women were willing to stand between them and danger." Margaret was sobbing now, but she was listening intently. James had stopped eating entirely, his attention focused on Thomas's words. "David didn't die for nothing," Thomas continued, his voice growing stronger. "He died so that other people could live freely, so that other families could sit around dinner tables like this one without fear. That's not a small thing, that's everything." "But he was supposed to come home," James said, his voice breaking for the first time. "He was supposed to live his life, have children, grow old. We failed him somehow." Thomas leaned forward in his wheelchair, looking directly into James's eyes. "Mr. Morrison, You raised a son who was willing to sacrifice everything for strangers he would never meet. You raised a hero. The fact that you're in pain now proves how much you loved him, but David wouldn't want your love to destroy you. Margaret reached across the table and took Thomas's hand in both of hers. How do you bear it? She asked. How do you go on when everything has changed? Thomas squeezed her hands gently. One day at a time, and by remembering that David's story isn't over as long as people remember what he stood for. Every time you smile, every time you help someone else, every time you choose to keep living fully, you honor his memory. The conversation continued long into the evening, with tears and laughter mixing together as the Morrisons began to share stories about David that they hadn't told anyone in 2 years. For the first time since their son's death, they were able to speak about him with joy instead of just sorrow. As the evening wore on, something remarkable began to happen in the Morrison household. Margaret brought out photo albums that had been hidden away for 2 years, sharing stories about David's childhood with the kind of warmth that had been missing from her voice since his death. James found himself laughing at memories of his youngest son's determination to fix everything in the house. Even as a small boy, he once took apart our entire radio because he wanted to understand how it worked. James said, chuckling despite himself. Took him 3 days to put it back together, and when he finally did, it only played static. But he was so proud of himself for reassembling it. Thomas smiled, recognizing the same determined spirit that had driven David to military service. That curiosity and persistence probably saved lives in Afghanistan. The soldiers who ask questions and want to understand how things work are often the ones who spot problems before they become dangerous. Margaret wiped her eyes, but for the first time in months her tears were mixed with smiles. We used to be proud of him, you know. Before the grief took over, we were so proud of the man he'd become. You should still be proud, Thomas said firmly. Grief doesn't erase the accomplishments of the people we've lost. David earned every bit of your pride, and he always will. As the night grew later, Morrison Sr. began to open up about his own struggles. I stopped working because everything reminded me of David. He used to come into the workshop as a child, asking to help with projects. I couldn't bear to be in there without him. Thomas nodded thoughtfully. What if, instead of avoiding those memories, you used them to honor him? You could build something meaningful. Maybe furniture for families who've lost loved ones in service, or toys for children at military family events. Your skills could be David's legacy in action. The suggestion seemed to spark something in James's eyes that hadn't been there before. I never thought about it that way. I've been seeing the workshop as a place of loss, but maybe it could be a place of purpose instead. Margaret had been quiet for several minutes, looking at Thomas with an expression of growing understanding. You came here tonight to help us, didn't you? This wasn't just a casual dinner invitation. Morrison looked nervously between his parents and Thomas, but Thomas smiled and nodded. Your son was worried about you. He loves you both very much, and he could see that your grief was consuming you. He thought maybe talking to someone who had served alongside soldiers like David might help. Instead of being angry at the deception, Margaret reached out and hugged her surviving son tightly. You dear boy, she whispered, always trying to take care of everyone else. James stood up from the table and walked to a window that looked out over their small garden. We've been selfish, he said quietly. We've been so focused on our own pain that we forgot we still have a son who needs us. We forgot that David would be horrified to see us this way. Thomas wheeled his chair over to join James at the window. Grief isn't selfish, Mr. Morrison. It's love with nowhere to go. But you can redirect that love toward helping others, toward making sure David's sacrifice continues to matter in the world. The two men stood together in comfortable silence for a moment before James spoke again. Would you consider coming back sometime? Maybe helping me think through some projects I could work on? I think I'd like to get back into the workshop, but I might need some guidance on how to make it meaningful. I'd be honored, Thomas replied, meaning every word. And maybe Mrs. Morrison could think about volunteer work with military families. There are a lot of people out there who could benefit from her kindness and understanding. As the evening came to an end, the atmosphere in the Morrison house had completely transformed. The heavy curtains had been opened, letting in the moonlight. Laughter had replaced the oppressive silence that had dominated the home for 2 years. Most importantly, James and Margaret were looking at each other with affection instead of shared misery for the first time since David's death. When Thomas and Morrison prepared to leave, Margaret hugged Thomas goodbye with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for reminding us that it's okay to live again." On the train ride back to London, Morrison was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did tonight. You gave me my parents back." Thomas shook his head. "Your parents were always there. They just needed permission to start healing. Sometimes it takes an outsider to help people see that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting." 6 months later, Thomas received a letter from Margaret Morrison. She had started volunteering at a local veterans support center, helping other military families navigate their grief. James had built a beautiful memorial bench that now sat in their local park, dedicated to all the young men and women who had given their lives in service. But most importantly, they had learned to honor David's memory by living fully and helping others. The encounter that began with a simple ceremony at Buckingham Palace had grown into something none of them could have anticipated. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, human connection and purpose can help us find our way back to the light. Thomas had discovered that his own struggles had prepared him to help others, giving new meaning to both his survival and his sacrifice. The Royal Guard ceremony continued every day, but for Thomas, the Morrisons, and everyone whose lives they touched afterward, that one Thursday had changed everything.